Beyond Queer Stories.
So, welcome to Beyond Queer Stories. Today we have Nicklin with us. Nicklin was born and raised in Oak Park, Illinois, and educated in Denmark and New York. Nicklin's personal mission is to foster a world of unconditional love, acceptance, and empathy by sharing his story, building connections with like minded others, and living a life of service. So, welcome, Nicklin.
Thank
We're
you.
so excited to have you.
Pleasure. Thanks so much.
So, first question. What identities do you feel most influence your experiences?
Currently or historically?
Both.
Currently, as a male-identified person, specifically a white male-identified person, I believe that most strongly influences the way that I'm both perceived and able to move in the world. Having been assigned female at birth, though, I have a whole other set of experiences of what it's like to live in the world and the expectations of others and their reactions to whether or not I conform or don't conform to those expectations. So it's kind of an interesting amalgamation of how I perceive myself internally and also am aware of the perceptions of others.
What about historically?
So historically, as my sexuality and my gender identity have evolved, that's where things get a lot more complex. I mean, for instance, people ask me often how I identify as a sexual identity, and the labels get really murky. Because at one point, when I was assigned female and lived in the world as a woman, any relationship that I had with another female identified person would be perceived and was labeled, and I identified as a lesbian. And then I began transition, became more aware of the complexity of my own gender identity, and that began to influence how my sexual identity was perceived. Like, I have always internally been exactly the same person, but the labels started to get really confusing. Especially then if I had a relationship that was with a non-binary identified person, for instance, who may have been in some part of their transition process, from one label to another label. Or if I, for instance, they classify the relationships that I had when I was, say, in high school, I would have been heterosexual because I was legally female, at that time female identified, dating cisgendered men. Now that I am legally male, what would you call those? Are those gay? I don't know. Like, no, it gets really, really murky. Which is usually why I just default to the term queer, because it's kind of an umbrella term, and it denotes that my experience and my identity is somewhat out of the norm.
Yeah, that's why I appreciate once the word queer kind of got taken back by the community, because I feel like it allows for that nuance that is so hard to put these very restrictive labels onto.
Yeah.
And especially, like you said, like in regard to life experience, like these labels, and people have fluidity throughout their lifetime of different identities. And I personally love the word queer, and we both have talked about like identifying with that word.
Yeah, like my favorite all-encompassing term. It's like the saying queer is just like, even though it used to be a bad term, and it used to be like, you're this person, you're like derogatory term.
Yeah. I remember as a kid that there was a game that they used to actually play called Smear the Queer.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Basic premise was everybody had a ball, usually a football, sometimes some other round spherical thing, and then you would throw it into the air and somebody would catch it, and then literally everybody else would try to get the ball from that person by taking them down to the ground.
Oh, wow.
Like tackling.
And they labeled that person as like
Queer.
the queer person.
Yeah. So it was a performative demonstration of how anybody that was labeled queer was to be attacked.
Yeah, that's scary.
That's wild.
So, I mean, and these are children
Yeah,
Right.
playing a game.
yeah. I don't even like. I'm not surprised, but like hearing about the history of the word queer, it's just like really frustrating that that's what had to happen for this term to be seen as now like a positive term that people are using. But with it being a positive term, I'm glad that you, me, like we're all using it as like terms that are all encompassing of different identities, not only with like gender but with like sexuality as well. And the fact that it's now a positive term and people are understanding that it's no longer a derogatory thing, I think that's not only gonna like help bridge that gap that people seem to like focus on a lot, but also like have people who like maybe identify as like heterosexual or cis like understand that there's still room in that term for everybody, and that we should just understand that this is not a negative thing anymore. So it's just like really refreshing whenever I hear people say, "Yeah, I'm queer."
Yeah.
Cool. I'm not gonna stress about how you like what other denominations that is. Cool. We get it. It's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
And I know you were saying you grew up in the area, so I'm curious to kind of hear a little bit more about like what that was like in the area you grew up in, like just outside the city.
Right. So Oak Park has nominally been a progressive liberal community, certainly for the entirety of my lifetime. Around racial politics and economics, specifically, there was a lot of work in that regard, starting in the 60s. At the same time, there are probably more churches in Oak Park or religious institutions, because there are other things beyond Christian churches that also exist within Oak Park. So there is, in addition to this progressive movement, a deeply conservative, I would almost label it orthodoxy, cultural orthodoxy. And there's a lot of conflict that happens when communities that are that divergent try to come to a compromise somewhere in the middle to, you know, determine educational policy, social policy, economic policies, those kinds of things. As a kid, most of us aren't really aware of what the adults are all talking about or why things are the way they are. We just know that I go to this school because I live on this block, not on that block, and my friend who lives on this block goes to this other school because they live on that block. And, you know, the whole, like, well, we're trying to, like, make sure that there's diversity and proportionate, you know, economic and racial proportions, like, that's totally above most kids' heads. Unless you happen to have particularly progressive parents who are really invested in those kind of dialogues, in which case, maybe, like in my house, talk about those kinds of things. That I think, though, like many things, I was outside the norm. My parents, for many different reasons, you know, respected my intellectual ability to understand complex subjects, and I was very curious, and so I would ask a lot of questions. Why is this way? Where does this go? Why? How does this function? What reason is it that we do that thing this way? And at the same time, they were both raised in very traditional conservative cultures. My mother came from small town Ohio. My dad came from an equally small town originally in Indiana, and then his family moved to Michigan. They were both raised in a really conservative Christian tradition, and for their own personal reasons, you know, moved beyond and evolved past those that just didn't work for them. And so they found their own paths and own communities to, you know, try to make sense of the world. And they made sure that that was part of how they raised their children. And so my mom was really invested in making sure that we had as broad and comprehensive an education as we had available to us, given our economic means. And so one of the things that she understood was that, for better or for worse, religion affected everything. You know, religious traditions and religious faiths are part of history, they're part of art and culture, they're a part of music, they're a part of community building, and that having a good, solid understanding of how that happens and why and where, you know, those things come from, so that I had the best, my sisters and I had the best opportunity to move into the world. She saw that the Unitarian Universalists were people who really valued education. And so that was the compromise. My father, who left his faith and was like, faith is not for me. Faith traditions, especially Orthodox ones, are not something that he finds makes sense for him. So that was the compromise. And so I was raised in this really intellectual, cosmopolitan, where curiosity and exploration were really valued and celebrated. And my mother in particular was really invested in our education. And so they also connected with international communities, and so we would have students from outside the U.S. come and stay with us many times from many different countries around the world. So we learned languages and traditions and different, you know, yearly celebrations and things like that in our house, because even if we couldn't travel the world, that was a way that we could bring the world to us. And again, that was really important for my parents. They wanted us to be not just local citizens or U.S. citizens, but really understand that, like, we are part of a global community, and that we have more in common with people than we have different. And then I hit junior high and things got really complicated because I discovered that my expression of sexuality was different from the norm. And I hit face first into that wall of underground conservatism that exists in Oak Park, that very traditionalist, very Christian core. And that was traumatic because all of a sudden I was ostracized and made to feel really unwelcome, or sometimes actively, like, traumatized by people, like, you know, bumping into me in the halls, saying awful things to me at school, writing horrible notes and leaving them in the locker. You know, a lot of the ways that kids are really aggressive to people who are scapegoats for their own whatever going on. You know, I was the point person that they could direct all of that anxiety, that feeling of otherness, because I was queer. And at that time, Oak Park didn't really have good ways of dealing with that. There wasn't a gay straight alliance. There wasn't an organization locally that supported LGBT, and T wasn't even on the menu. It was LGB. There wasn't any kind of support organizations. And so I just, you know, my parents and I just kind of tried to do the best they could to get me through it to a place where, like, I could get out into the world or make contact with larger organizations that I might then find support and community, things like that, skills on how to live in a world that isn't always very friendly or safe or supportive, because there just wasn't resources available to us at that point.
So I'm curious a little bit, you mentioned, like, feeling the negative impact of kind of the religion you were around at that point. When did you connect with the Unitarian Church, and when did you become a part of that practice?
So I was raised in the Unitarian Church. So, like,
okay.
When I was a little kid,
Yeah.
my parents brought us into that community, and we were part of that community until I was probably about, I want to say 11, 12 or 13,
Okay.
somewhere around there.
Yeah.
After that, my parents realized that I had my own choices, and I began exploring spirituality on my own outside of a congregational community. And so I attended a Catholic youth group with my friends from the school because I wanted to be with my friends. And like the Catholic thing was just kind of, oh, well, that's where they go for youth group. Like it happens to be associated with the Catholic Church.
Right.
The Catholic Church that they belong to is a very open-minded, especially within their youth program, an incredibly open-minded, youth-oriented, youth-affirming ministry. And so it was a good safe space for me to really explore spirituality. At the same time, I was studying things like Wicca and Buddhism and different pagan traditions because I loved mythology. I was a super mythology nerd when I was a little kid. Like, I probably about 7, 8, 9 years old had this absolute obsession with Greek and Roman gods. Oh, and Egyptian gods.
Oh,
and I memorized the entire like family tree of the Greek and Roman pantheon, and the
at that young
overlaps.
age too.
Yeah,
Wow.
and the overlaps between how the Romans borrowed Greek gods and how the mythology